All right, mutual aid. How many folks here know what mutual aid is? Okay, a couple. How many folks actually have a mutual aid agreement with another utility? Okay, good. Okay, so we wanted to walk through mutual aid because it is a part of a couple of options that you can utilize. And we wanted to make sure that there's at least a basic understanding of what needs to be involved in putting together a mutual aid agreement if you're going to use it to comply with Senate Bill 3. So that's what we're going to do here, just talk about that. So here's a definition of what mutual aid is. It's agreements establish the terms under which one party provides resources, personnel, teams, facilities, equipment, and supplies to another party. And that comes from the National Incident Management System guideline that's put out by FEMA on what mutual aid is. And so just kind of just a real quick overview of what the federal government defines mutual aid is. There's another one. It's put out by the American Water Works Association. It's in their Emergency Planning Manual 19. And it's basically providing rapid and short-term deployment emergency services to restore and affect utilities' critical operations. So that's what we're trying to do when we enter into a mutual aid agreement, is we want to make sure that if our resources are taxed and my utility can no longer provide the services for whatever reason, for whatever impact, one of the ways to plan ahead to address that is to look at who's around you and who's willing to help you. So there's a few different types of mutual aid. There's a local automatic mutual aid. And so that's where you'll see this a lot with police and fire, where they have put in place this agreement that they don't need a actual request for services. They'll go ahead and they'll help based on a predefined area where they'll go in and they'll help out another jurisdiction. So that's local automatic mutual aid. Now, local mutual aid is a little more formal, and that can be between any kind of entity, district, cities, all those kinds of entities where there would need to be a request for a system. And this is a little bit more formal. It's typically going to be documented pretty well how that request is going to come in, how it's going to be fulfilled, and what's going to happen. The regional is usually with a group of utilities or group of entities. Typically, you'll find this with COGS, regional type organizations where everyone in that group will have a mutual aid agreement for some support in some type of situations and providing these different resources and services. And then you have the intrastate, where that's usually run at the state level by either the state regulatory agency or a nonprofit or association. And then you have the statewide, which is statewide, like we have here in Texas, TxWarn, and we'll talk about that more in depth. And then there's the interstate, where states will go help an adjacent or neighboring state. The term that they use is emergency management. It's EMAC, I forgot what the A is now, but it's emergency mutual aid compact. Basically, where a lot of times when we have these big natural disasters, folks from Texas will go help the folks in Louisiana and vice versa. And so that's what the interstate mutual aid agreement is. So if you're going to put one together, you want to have some things documented. You want to know what the purpose and scope of the agreement. You're going to want to define why you're entering in this mutual aid agreement and what is it going to entail. You want to have some definitions of the common terms that are going to be utilized in that agreement. So make sure everyone understands what each one of these terms means in the context of this agreement. And then the roles and responsibility, who's doing what? You know, if something happens, when someone responds, what are the activities they're going to do? And what are their responsibilities to fulfill those activities? And then you want governance, structure, and operations oversight. So in other words, who's going to maintain this agreement? How are decisions going to be made when there's a request, or when there's not a request, when there's time to revise it, or after an event there needs to be some revisions. Just how is it going to be, how is this whole mutual aid situation going to be run? And then of course, when you are providing aid, you're going to expend your resources, and so there needs to be some information about reimbursement, right? How is the responding utility going to get reimbursed for the resources that they expended? And also reciprocity for licensing and other requirements to operate in your jurisdiction. These are all the things that need to be included in the mutual aid agreement. Additional things, procedures and protocols. What are we doing? You know, what specifically are things that are going to be done, and how are they going to be done during incidents where mutual aid is enacted? And then, of course, insurance. Insurance is always important. Any kind of activity like that, things can happen. You know, when you're responding during mutual aid, it's not in the best of circumstances. So there's a risk of things happening. So you want to make sure the insurance is, how that's going to work is clearly defined. And then, of course, the term of the agreement. Is it perpetual, or is there a date that it's going to end? And then, you know, of course, when these type of activities occur, there can be disagreements, misunderstandings, and things need to be resolved. And so there needs to be a process. Dispute resolution needs to be defined in the mutual aid agreement. And also workers' compensation needs to be rolled in as well. When you have staff working from different jurisdictions, you need to know who's covering them and who's not. And all this, I said, is from the National Incident Management System Guideline for Mutual Aid. So it's how FEMA is going to view these things. And so as long as these things are defined in the mutual aid agreement, that helps when dealing with FEMA if they need to be involved in any kind of reimbursement for activities, and also just documentation of the incidents. Additional things, termination of the agreement, that needs to be defined if that is the case. And then, as I mentioned earlier, modification or any amendment needs to occur. There does need to be, as a part, maybe an addendum, is an overall operational plan for this mutual aid agreement, how things are going to work. It needs to be defined and agreed upon by all parties. And then if there needs to be any recognition of qualification and certifications, I can imagine with, you know, in the utilities, you want to make sure that operational certifications and levels are defined. You want to have the right folks doing the right jobs. So, as I mentioned, the TxWarn. How many folks have heard of TxWarn? Man, I wish there was a few more hands in that. Okay, glad we're doing this presentation. So it's the Texas Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network. This is Texas's statewide mutual aid program. There's a WARN in every state of the country and in few provinces in Canada that's strictly for water and wastewater. And so in TxWarn, these are the partners, association organizations here in Texas that are a part of this group. And that's important because you can see here that one of the groups that are involved is the Texas Division of Emergency Management. And in the legislation and the requirements, any mutual aid that's utilized, they need to be in coordination with that group. So if you're part of TxWarn, you're already tied into TDM. And for folks that don't know, they're responsible for managing large-scale incidents that impact the state. The natural disasters, the hurricanes, the things like if There is you hear about the refinery fires and leaks and things like that. They oversee the response and recovery of those type incidents for the state. And so that's why in the legislation there's a requirement that a mutual aid agreement coordinates with that group. And then you have some other entities. TCEQ is one. And then you have other nonprofit associations like Texas Rural Water Association, American Water Works Association, and the Water Environment Association of Texas. They're all our partners and actively work with TxWarn. All right, so a little background on it. It was created after Hurricane Katrina. Just the devastation of that, Texas sent a lot of folks over to help out the response and recovery effort of that. And so kind of keying on that, this type of program existed in Florida and California prior to 2005. There was only places in the country that this type of program existed. And so folks with Texas Association of American Water Works saw that and said, hey, we need to get this in Texas. And so they established it and worked with TCEQ to get some partial funding. And then just a few weeks later, Hurricane Rita hit the southeast coast of Texas. And because TxWarn was in place, there was ability to do, as among other things, as an example here, get a generator, a pretty good sizable generator to the city of Beaumont when they really needed it. And so that was kind of one of the first indicators that this might work in the state. As I mentioned, it has been partially funded by TCEQ since 2006. Knowing that because of the size of the membership you can see here, almost 1,500 member entities, and it covers about 84% of the state population, it's become the go-to source for TCEQ and the Texas Division of Emergency Management, their state operations center, which is where they monitor incidents and coordinate response activities. It's become the kind of the go-to for managing the part of the response activities associated with water and wastewater. And so that's how it's come into play. It is up and growing every day, all day. There's the ability to respond, to take requests 24 hours a day, every day of the year. The other component that's developed over time is training on response and recovery. So TxWarn does, in conjunction with TCEQ and EPA and other entities, sponsor training throughout the year to help improve system resilience for water and wastewater systems. There's a couple events that have occurred over the last few years where TxWarn has partnered with EPA to put on workshops like community-based water resiliency, where you talk about different sectors of a community, like the water sector and public health or electricity, and to get those folks together and talk about how the loss of power or how the loss of water or how a major impact to public health, how they impact each other, and talk through scenarios and do some hands-on kind of training to try to raise that awareness. And so that's an example of some of the training that TxWarn's done in the past. The idea behind it is the goal is building system resiliency or resilience, helping systems, water and wastewater, to basically respond effectively and as it says here, accommodate change gracefully with catastrophic failure. Times of disaster. That's their goal. They want to be able to make sure that water and wastewater utilities can get back up as quickly as possible so they can start functioning again and start providing service to their customers, which is objective one, just basically continuity of operations for drinking water and wastewater systems. The training part comes into the preparedness area, and then the response and recovery planning. So pre-event, they do a lot of work to do that, to help make sure that there are resources in place, there's training available for understanding of how to implement different measures to make your system more resilient. Because the key, we're all supposed to be help maintain public health and actually public confidence in your water service. And so working with a mutual aid organization and like this one can help with that. And as I mentioned earlier, really promoting the interdependence between these major life support sectors: public health, emergency services, critical manufacturing, and then electrical generation. They all key off of water production, and so those sectors, as well as the water sector, need to work together to understand how, during times of incidents as well as normal operations, how they can work together. So, what is it? So it is basically utility mutual aid response system is really what it is. And so being a member of TxWarn means that you will pledge or volunteer services, equipment, resources to help out when there's an incident and there's a request from another member to get assistance. It is voluntary. Just because you're a member and just because you said, hey, I have this equipment available or these people available, you don't have to necessarily fulfill every request. Not at all. It is completely voluntary. But what it does, it assists in pre-planning and identifying resources. So right now, TxWarn has a certain amount of items that have been pledged by its members to be available during an incident. And so that pre-planning and knowing these resources available, when their request comes in, they can at least at this point say, okay, we know we have these things, let's do a request out and get some responses of who can help out in this particular incident. And so that gives a little element of pre-planning. Again, it is voluntary, but at least there's this group of things that are available to be utilized for an incident. And so what that does is it really helps with efficiency, kind of break through some of the paperwork and bureaucracy that can be involved when you go and do request state assistance. Now, I'm not saying state assistance is bad, not at all. But if you do that, if you request resources from, say, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, through your county, there's some paperwork involved, and there's a different process than going through mutual aid, and it can be a little bit more cumbersome. Sometimes it's what you have to do. For the large requests, that's actually a really good way to go. But this is just another option that is available and it is approved by those entities to be utilized. There is a website that we'll go through here in a little while that provides easy communication, resource identification. As I mentioned, if there's a request, then there's some pre-event matching that goes on so that there's already kind of things that are earmarked based on where the request comes from and understanding what's available from the partners. So the request can come from anywhere. Most of the time it's from utilities, but TxWarn can generate a request as well based on information they get. There have been requests from TCEQ or TDM from the State Emergency Operations Center. So again, they're clued in with that group, and so there's a lot of times where they'll request TxWarn to, hey, go out and can you guys help out this utility? Can you find some assistance for them? And so TxWarn responsibility is to go do that, but also to track those requests and responses that they get under that utility's name and keep up with that so that those requests don't get lost in the process, that either they get fulfilled or not, but there's a response either way to the request and utility. So they're monitored during the incident, they're monitored 24/7. They have volunteer event managers that are assigned these requests, and they're required to follow up with all these requests. And they coordinate daily to make sure that the the requests are fulfilled or not, but long as someone knows where the status is. And so the resources are tracked, and there's constant communication with the requesting entity of estimated time of arrival of whatever resources they request, and they coordinate between the entity requesting and entity fulfilling those requests. And then after the event, they also track getting back what was borrowed, what was utilized. And then they'll put together a report at the end of the incident that can be utilized for documentation for wherever it's needed. After action review, reimbursement from a public entity like FEMA, from the state. So that all that comes with utilizing TxWarn and being a member of it. So just as additional reasons why to at least consider being part of TxWarn is, again, it's the reduced cost of owning or maintaining equipment, because there's no cost for it. Being a member of TxWarn is absolutely free. So knowing that there's some things like generators that are available, if that is why it is an option, as that was listed in Senate Bill 3. It was also listed in the Senate bill for the Harris and Fort Bend County programs, because there is availability of a few generators and other equipment, chemicals, and staff. All those kind of things are available through this mutual aid program. It's like it's a virtual warehouse. So like TxWarn doesn't have a big warehouse in Austin full of stuff. They rely on the members to house and maintain that equipment, but they have volunteered to provide that when there's been a request, if they're able to. And so that's kind of how it works. Hopefully we'll reduce downtime, reduce loss. You can get back up, you get your request fulfilled, and it's a lot cheaper than purchasing and contracting that emergency support. Now, I'll be real honest. There are some events that will tax even a statewide mutual aid, and we saw that during Uri, right? Because of just how widespread that event was, it was hard for people to share. But it did happen. There were some responses, there were some requests that were fulfilled during Uri. Took a little longer. I mean, travel was a little hazardous for a while. And so it was a little bit slower to get off the ground than the normal, because most of the incidents we have in this state tend to be very local or regionalized. And so you have folks that can respond from other regions of the state that can fulfill those requests and help out. But again, there's not a whole lot of foolproof options out there. And so, but this is just another tool to consider. And then there's the training aspect of it, because TxWarn does a lot of training, but also coordinates with organizations like TRWA, like TCEQ. They get the word out. So if you're a member, you'll get notified of all the different types of training that are related to resiliency going on around the state and even nationally in some instances. And so overall, that'll hopefully improve resilience when systems are made aware and they go through training and understand the things, measures, and protocols they can put in place to help with responding to and recovering from disasters. Faster response times, ideally. Again, hopefully we can get things out quicker. And then some possible lower insurance costs. Being part of mutual aid, in some instances, insurance companies may reduce your costs knowing that you have that as a backup plan. And then, of course, if you're not buying equipment, buying things, then you don't have those costs. Or if you do, knowing that you have mutual aid, you could have some lower borrowing costs or ratings with other agencies that do look at that when you go out for loans and grants and things like that. Hopefully improve customer satisfaction by being able to maintain service during rough times. And then just the overall ability to respond to all hazards. So on the TxWarn website, there is actually a model mutual aid agreement. And that agreement is structured very similar to what I just talked about, but it is in place for privately owned utilities. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But if you're a privately owned utility and you want to be a member of TxWarn, you'll actually have to review and sign that mutual aid agreement. If you're publicly owned, say a city or district, then you're automatically covered by the state's statewide mutual aid rules that are found in the government code. But getting back to the mutual aid agreement that's online, it calls for, if you are part of TxWarn and you abide by this agreement, so what happens? What's the process? Like I said, a utility requests assistance. What will happen in that assistance is there'll be a request of what kind of damage you have, so it'll be over the phone kind of damage assessment. And then what do you need? Type of personnel, equipment, material, supplies. Now, how long do you need it? Right? All very important questions, because someone responding, they're going to know how long are their people going to be gone? How long is their equipment going to be gone? Also, kind of get an update of the current weather status and forecast. Is it safe to travel down there now? Has the event passed, or is there a potential of other things happening? Then again, estimated time for arrival, where to meet. All these types of procedural things are going to be asked as part of the request. So then in the responding utility, here's what I mentioned earlier, there's no obligation to respond. If you're a member of TxWarn, it's voluntary. So even though part of being a member, you have to commit something, you're not obligated to respond on every single request. You can say no. You can say, hey, I need to keep my people here. We're having this issue. Or I can't let you have my generator. I need it for this or that. And so that's completely acceptable. No pressure on that. But you will, if you are a responding utility, then you have to, describe what you're going to be able to provide. Personnel, equipment, how long you can provide them, and then, how are they skilled? How are they licensed? What are you going to be able to, what level of response can you provide? And then there has to be someone responsible, especially if you're sending people or equipment that needs to be supervised and returned eventually. There's going to have to be somebody from that responding utility that is responsible for that. And then, of course, between the two parties, they'll work out reimbursement of expenses and billing and how that's going to work. So TxWarn doesn't get in the middle of that. That'll be between the responding utility and the requesting utility. That agreement also has insurance lined out, liability and immunity. And so all the full details on the TxWarn Mutual Aid agreement is here at the website. And it says, no, it does not apply if you have an existing mutual aid agreement. So if you have an agreement with another entity, this doesn't impact that. Or if you previously had an agreement in place there, prior to the statewide mutual aid rules, then you don't have to worry about the mutual aid agreement that's there listed online. All right. So as an example, on the TxWarn website, there's a list of resources for resilience. And one of them that's really, I wanted to point out, is All Hazards Consequence Management. And it's a document that was put together going about 15 years ago from a cross-section of water utilities from all over the country, as well as some of the federal and state agencies that deal with this. And it basically is a guide on how to prepare for incidents and events that can impact your water system and how to respond and recover from them. And it's put in like a checklist form, so it's really easy to use. You can use it to evaluate what plans you have in place already and see how effective they are, but also can help you plan for all hazards of some that you may have not considered. Idea behind is it improves resiliency and has a huge pre-planning aspect to it. You can look at, eliminate, or mitigate consequences associated with problems that can arise from an incident. It can come up with processes and things in place that you can address problems once they've been identified. Overall, the idea is that it improves resiliency, helps you identify vulnerabilities in your system, and then improve your preparedness response for those vulnerabilities, and then hopefully a more rapid and effective response. Now, I picked this one out because there is a section in here that deals with power outages. And so this is just additional information about recovery planning. But in there, on the pages 24 to 27, they ask a lot of questions that can help you put together your EPP. And so, again, this document's on the website, free of charge. You go there, you can just download it, and you can look at it. I'll walk through that during our resources section because I don't know how our internet access is working right now. So I'll do that this afternoon. We'll go through and we'll look at it. But joining TxWarn is simple. It's going to the website, www.TxWarn.org. Input the information that's requested. When you click on Become a TxWarn Member Today button, you're going to also need to include key staff, contact information. Again, if you're a public utility, you're automatically covered under the statewide mutual aid agreements or requirements or rules, so you don't have to sign the agreement. But if you're privately owned utility, then you have to electronically sign that mutual aid agreement to become a member. All right, and here's just the contact information for TxWarn, both email and phone. Any questions? All right, everybody's ready for lunch. Oh, yes, sir.
So basically my question is, how does this fit into the options that you went over earlier?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a section where mutual aid is a good option?
Yes.
Like for us, we're a corporation, we're in several other states. Will we be able to use this as an additional option? Because we could pull resources from Illinois or New Jersey or wherever, and expertise from around the country. How would that benefit us and the EPP?
So you could utilize that for, the option here is option 2B in your template. And you can select that as what you're going to utilize to get resources to provide service to your customers if you lose electrical power. And so if you're, what you would do is you'd become a member of TxWarn, fill out that information, and then you could commit resources. So you could commit those resources that you have from other states if you have access to them. If you during any kind of incident or event, whatever you have access to that you can volunteer and you can let others utilize to help them get back on their feet during an event, then you would just provide that information along with your template and that selection as your option. And yeah, that's what you could do. Good question. Any others? All right. So how are we on time and lunch?
So what we have so far, we are still early. So it's 11:40, I'm gonna call it 11:45. I know it's before that. But 11:45, we initially have an hour and 15 minutes for lunch. So we're gonna call it lunch break for those online. And we're gonna aim at trying to come back at 1 o'clock. So I guess tune back in by 1. For those here live with us, we'll get started a little early. Our lunch should be showing up in the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, if there's no other questions, 1 o'clock. Thank you.